Right, so here is our Power Pivot model consisting of 7 tables that we imported from various data sources. Before you start creating reports from this model, it probably makes sense to go through all the tables, go through the columns, and explore the data, and also spend some time actually refining the model, such as renaming the column names, renaming the tables, formatting the columns, so the model becomes more intuitive before we start analyzing it. So here we are in the Power Pivot window, and again, if you have closed your Excel workbook and then you reopen it, remember to go to the Power Pivot tab and click on the Power Pivot window to open the model. As I said, we have 7 tables, and Power Pivot imports data as tables. Each table has rows and has columns. For your convenience, the Power Pivot modeling environment has options for sorting columns, for filtering data, so you can understand, you can get familiar with the content of these tables. For example, in the employees table, let's say we want to know which employee has been with the company the longest. So there is a hire date column, and what we can do is to select this column, and then in the sort and filter ribbon group, there are buttons sort oldest to newest. And when we do that, we realize that Guy Gilbert has been the longest with the company. To clear the sort, just press the clear sort button. We have also options to filter data. For example, in the same table we have a marital status column. And if we expand the drop down in the column header, we see all the distinct values that are loaded in that column. So we have M for married and S for single. If you want to filter only the married employees, we can select only the M checkbox, and that gives us a subset of the data in the employees table of those employees who are married. Now, it's very important to remember that the sorting and filtering in the Power Pivot window, they are very similar to what you can do during import, but there is a big difference. During import, when you filter data, you essentially limit the data that you import in the model. Once the data is imported, the sorting and filtering that you do is just for you to get familiar with the data. It has no effect on the data in the model. In fact, it has no data on the reports, because when you go and create reports, they will have access to all data imported in the model. So again, sorting and filtering is just for you to get familiar with the data. Filtering can get more complex. For example, let's say in the employee table we have a base rate column, and we want to find out which employees have a base rate higher than $50. We can expand again the column drop down, and there is if the column is a numeric column, there is a number filters option, and there are different criteria here. Let's say if we want to find out which employees have a higher rate, we can click on greater than or equal to, let's say type 50, to see those who have base rate higher than $50. And then we have a list of 3 employees. So you can do this kind of exploration, sorting and filtering, to understand your data. And of course, if you have filters, you can click on clear all filters to remove the filtering, and you can see again the data the way it was imported in the model. The next thing that you probably want to do is to rename tables. So for example, if you take a look at the tabs at the bottom, obviously we'll benefit from some kind of a naming convention here. And the naming convention that I use is for fact tables. tables that store sales information, I use plural naming convention, and for the rest of the lookup tables, I use a single name, single case convention. Of course, you don't have to follow my convention, but let's go ahead and rename those tables. And to do that, you right-click on the Table tab and click Rename. Let's rename the Date table to Date, the Reseller table to Reseller Sales. Press Enter. The Sales Territories table to Sales Territory. The Employees table to Employee. And a Reseller table to Reseller. Products table to Product. And the Currencies table to Currency. There we go. We got our tables renamed. Renaming tables is important because this is how they will appear in client tools. This is how, for example, if you create Excel pivot reports, the table names will show in the Power Pivot field list. The next thing that we want to do is to spend some time revisiting each column in each table and making changes as needed. So let's start with the date table. This column, full date alternate key, which came from the AdventureWorks data warehouse, it's actually a useful column for analysis because it has the actual date as a date type. However, the name is not that intuitive, so what we can do is to double click on the column header and change the column name to date. Also, because we took out the Spanish and French columns, we have a couple of columns here that have English prefix. But what we can do is to just rename these columns to take out the English word because it's a little bit confusing from end user standpoint why some columns have English but others don't. And the last thing that we want to do as far as the date table is to hide the date key column. This column is very useful for relationships, to create relationships from other tables to this table, but it's not so useful for analysis. So what we can do is to right click it and say hide from client tools. And when the column is hidden, it appears grayed out, so you can immediately see which columns actually are not going to be visible in the report tools. Next, let's go to the Reseller Sales table. The changes that we want to make here is this table is a fact table and it has a lot of columns with key suffix, so we can join this table to lookup tables. And these columns are very useful, but they're not so useful for analysis, so we shouldn't show them properly to end users. So what we can do is to select the first column, product key, hold the shift key and select the sales territory key column to select all of these columns, and then we can right click the selection and say hide from client tools to again exclude those columns so they're not visible from in report clients. We can also take a look at the numeric columns in this table, and if you want to make changes to these numeric columns, we could essentially select the columns that we need to change things like data types or formatting, but it appears that all these columns are formatted as a currency with 2 decimal places, so they look good. Moving to the sales territory table, we imported this table from an analysis services queue. During the import process, the table import wizard has assigned very long names to the columns. So what we can do is to rename the columns. For example, the first one to territory group, the second one to territory country, The third one to territory region. And the last column we'll rename to revenue. Now if we take a look at this column in the Home tab, we'll see that the Power Pivot has inferred its data type as a decimal number. We can leave it like this, but also we can change it to currency because this contains currency. This column contains currency data, and we can do that by expanding the date type and changing the data type of this column to currency. You're going to be prompted because we're doing a kind of a narrowing data conversion from a decimal type to a currency, but that's okay in this case. And suppose that you want to, by default, to format this column not to show any decimals. We could click the decrease decimal button here in the formatting group. So when this table is shown on the reports, it doesn't have any decimals. Moving on to the reseller table, we can hide the reseller key column from Client Tools. One interesting feature for a Power Pivot for Excel, which is similar to Excel, is that we can freeze a column. So for example, for our convenience, when you scroll through a white table, we may want one of the columns to remain visible while scrolling. To do that, we just right click the column header and say freeze columns, and then now that we scroll to the right, this column remains visible. This is just for your convenience, has no effect on reports. What we can do here while in the reseller table, we can format the annual sales column as currency with no decimals, and the same thing for annual revenue. Okay. The product table, there is a column here called show description, which is really not that useful for analysis. We imported this table from the reporting services report. We can go and delete, re-import that table, go to the table definition and remove this column, or we can simply delete it from here. For example, we can right click on the column and say delete columns to remove this table from to remove this column from the table. Also, we can spend some time actually renaming some columns. From double product category 2, we can rename it to product category. Product subcategory, the second column we can rename to product subcategory. Category. Product model. And product name. And again, we can spend some time formatting just to provide default formatting for numeric column. For example, standard cost and list price, we can format them as currency. 2 decimal places is good. And finally, the currency table. We can hide the first column from Client Tools. This is not useful for analysis. We can rename the other 2 columns to currency code with no space and currency name with no space. Power Pivot allows to define descriptions for tables and columns. Some reporting clients, such as Excel, support those descriptions. For example, they can show them as tooltips. So optionally, so we could revisit each table and column and provide useful descriptions. For example, if we want to provide description for the currency table, we can right-click on its tab and then go to a description and then enter some text to describe that table. We can do also the same thing for columns. So when other users look at our model, I'm sorry, I wanted to click the description field. So when other users look at these columns or point the mouse to these columns in Excel, tooltip actually will pop up to show description for this column or table. That was it as far as working with tables and columns.